This is Chapter 1 of The Wolf's Vow, written by Alexi Hartwood. The wolf ran because the wolf had nothing else to do. Dawn Patrol, North Ridge, the same route I'd been running for 15 years, since I was old enough for Clay to trust me with the perimeter, since my shifts stabilized and the wolf stopped fighting the man for dominance and settled into the uneasy truce that passed for coexistence. The ridge at dawn was the closest thing I had to religion. The light came up behind the eastern peaks in stages, gray, then silver, then the first gold touching the snowfields. The pines threw long shadows across the snow. The air at this altitude was thin and cold and clean, stripped of everything human, carrying only the scents that belonged to the mountain: pine resin, frozen earth, the distant mineral sharpness of exposed rock. I ran in wolf form. Gray fur, gray eyes, gray morning. The wolf's body was designed for this terrain, the wide paws spreading weight across the snow, the dense undercoat holding heat against the cold, the cardiovascular system that could sustain a 20-mile run without distress. In wolf form, I was faster, quieter, more efficient. In wolf form, the silence inside me was tolerable. In human form, the silence was something else. The patrol covered 12 miles. I ran the ridge, dropped to the fire trail, swept the western boundary where the pack's territory met the national forest, circled back through the creek drainage, and climbed to the overlook that gave me a visual on the valley below. Pine Hollow spread out like a model village, the diner's roof, the church steeple, the thread of Main Street connecting them. Houses with smoke rising from chimneys, cars in driveways, the ordinary architecture of human lives being lived. I checked the boundary markers, scent posts, the wolf's version of a property line, refreshed weekly by the patrol rotation. I checked for incursions, bear tracks from a black bear that had been pushing the southern boundary, coyote sign along the creek, the occasional human hiker who'd wandered off the national forest trails. Nothing threatening, nothing unusual. The territory was secure. The territory was always secure. That was my job. That was all my job was. I shifted at the tree line above my cabin. The transition was practiced, a controlled unraveling, wolf to man, fur to skin, forelegs to two. The cold hit immediately. I dressed from the cache I kept in a waterproof bag under the boulder: jeans, flannel, boots. The wolf's heat lingered in my skin for 20 minutes after the shift, a residual warmth that made the Montana cold manageable. My cabin. The door I never locked, because no wolf locked their door. The pack was the security system, and the pack never slept. The interior was clean, spare, organized with the precision of a man who had nothing to organize except space. A kitchen with one mug on the counter, a table with one chair, a bed that was made with military corners because the discipline of making it was the first thing I did each morning and the last structure I could impose on a day that had no other shape. I made tea, not coffee. The caffeine interacted with the wolf's metabolism, producing a jittery, agitated state that made the shift unpredictable. Tea was gentler. A small cup, black, no sugar. I stood at the counter and drank it and looked out the window at the mountains, and the silence pressed in from every direction. This was my life. Patrol, station, reports, tea, the cabin, the bed with its military corners, the window and the mountains, and the silence that was not peaceful but habitual, the silence of a man who'd arranged his life so efficiently around solitude that he'd forgotten solitude was not the same as peace. The pack filled some of it. Clay, whose authority was the bedrock I'd built my stability on. Luke, whose steadiness was the closest thing I had to friendship. Jory, whose warmth made the station feel like something other than a workplace. Ben and Helen, whose noisy domesticity was both comforting and painful. Comforting because it proved wolves could build lives. Painful because it proved I hadn't. I was 32 years old. I had never been in love. I had never wanted to be. That's not exactly true. The wolf wanted. The wolf had always wanted. A mate, a bond, the deep biological imperative that drove every wolf toward the connection that would complete the circuit. But wanting and expecting were different things. Bonds were rare. Many wolves lived entire lives without one. My father had bonded with my mother, one of the few in his generation, and the bond had been everything the elders described. Total, transformative, the kind of love that rewired your neural architecture and made everything before it look like a rough draft. My mother had died when I was 7. Cancer, the human kind, indifferent to the wolf's biology, targeting the organs that were the same in both forms. She'd shifted during the last weeks, trying to outrun the pain in the wolf's body. But the wolf's body had the same cancer, and the shift only changed the shape of the suffering, not its depth. My father had survived her by 3 years before the bond's severance finished what grief had started. 3 years of a man disappearing, not physically, but in every other way. His eyes went flat, his voice went monotone. The wolf inside him, severed from its bond, stopped pressing against his skin entirely. It was as if the wolf had died first, and the man was running on the residual energy of a life that had already ended. He died in his sleep. I found him in the morning. I was 10. The bed was made with military corners, the discipline of routine the only thing he'd maintained, and his face was calm, and the bond's absence was visible in the way his body had finally relaxed, as if the tension of living without her had been a physical weight he'd been carrying and had finally set down. Clay took me in, the alpha's obligation to an orphaned wolf. I grew up in Clay's house, under Clay's authority, absorbing Clay's philosophy. Control was survival. Discipline was love. The pack was the structure that kept individual wolves from destroying themselves. So I knew what the bond could do. I knew what it could give and what it could take. And I'd made the calculation, not consciously, not as a decision, but as a slow accumulation of evidence, that a life without the bond was a life without that particular catastrophe. Solitude was sustainable. Solitude was safe. Solitude was the armor I'd built at 10 years old when I watched my father die of a broken heart and decided, with the clear-eyed logic of a child, that the thing that had killed him would not kill me. I finished my tea, washed the mug, set it upside down on the counter, drove to the station, filed the patrol report. Clay reviewed it with the methodical attention he gave everything. Not because the report required scrutiny, but because Clay believed that consistency was the foundation of discipline, and discipline was the foundation of survival. North Ridge clear. Western boundary clear. Bear sign at the South Creek, same black bear, pushing the line. We'll redirect it next patrol. Anything else? No. Nothing else. Nothing ever else. The same report, the same route, the same morning, the same silence filling the space between the words. At the station, I ate lunch alone. At the table in the back room where the pack kept a microwave and a coffee maker and a collection of mugs that represented every wolf who'd ever worked there. My mug was plain. No logo, no joke, no sentimental inscription. A mug that did what mugs did, and nothing more. I ate a sandwich. I read a report. I existed in the space between tasks with the specific, practiced patience of a man who had learned to fill time without filling it with meaning. Afternoon patrol, South Ridge. The same route I'd run the previous Tuesday and would run the following Tuesday and had run every Tuesday for the past decade. The wolf's paws on the familiar snow, the familiar scents, the familiar silence. The wolf ran because the wolf had nothing else to do. And the man let it run because the man had nothing else to give it. This was the life. This was the shape. This was the architecture of a man who had arranged every element of his existence to need nothing, want nothing, risk nothing. It would have worked forever. It would have held. If the wind hadn't shifted on a Tuesday in January and carried a scent down from the highway that rewrote every calculation I'd ever made. But that was tomorrow. Tonight was tonight. Tonight was the cabin and the mug and the bed with the military corners and the silence that pressed in from every side. Tonight was before. And before was the last night I would ever be alone. I just didn't know it yet.